I am Jean Walsh with the Papa John Center for Entrepreneurship here at Iowa State University, and we are hosting the Start Something series. This year's series, we're really excited to be featuring our great professors from Iowa State and the Ivy College of Business who participate in our entrepreneurship programs. Today, Christy Morgan is going to take us through her research on leveraging your socioeconomic background as a strength and help us to apply the findings into our individual real-world entrepreneurship journey. Christy, thank you for joining us and for your time today and sharing your research. And I will let you take it from here with your content.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jean, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad and thankful that you're here and excited to talk about this topic. So I know that Jean had asked, but I'd invite you again, if you're on the call, just to go ahead and drop in the chat kind of where you're at in your entrepreneurial journey. So whether that is as a student right now, or if you're actually like in the trenches as an entrepreneur, I'd be happy to see that. In many ways, so I can kind of think about how this content might actually apply and kind of adjust to that through the next hour that we have together. So excited for the time. I will use the chat and ask you to jump in the chat kind of regularly. So please jump in there. Don't hold back. Hopefully everything I ask is relatively simple or not that intimidating. So again, as Jean said, my name is Christy, and I'm an assistant professor in the Management and Entrepreneurship department here at the Ivy College of Business. A little bit about me, since I don't know, actually, I recognize some familiar names, but don't know all of you. I was born in Iowa, so I'm an Iowa native, and after quite a roundabout journey, leaving when I was in elementary school to head to Chicago, and then Arkansas, Michigan, Colorado, Arkansas, and then all of those places. I am back here again. I came back to start as a faculty member in the fall, and I'm thrilled to be here and am enjoying kind of re-exploring Iowa later in life. So broadly speaking, my research really focuses on diversity in and around organizations, and specifically on social class and how it impacts people's working lives. So it's really my honor today to get to discuss social class or socioeconomic status, and specifically how that plays out in terms of entrepreneurship. So I have a few things that I think are important notes to start. One is just sort of about research in general. And I know Mike, if you were on that call, said something very similar. In research, we're really looking for patterns in behavior, which means that we're looking at something on average. But there are always exceptions to general patterns. And so perhaps an example that I can give you is we can say, for example, that on average, basketball players are taller than football players. So from these 5 basketball players who are on screen, the average height is 6 feet 6 inches, which is much taller than I am. From the 5 football players who are on screen, their average height is 6 feet 2 inches, which means that, right, on average, all things equal, basketball players are about 4 inches taller than football players. But that generalization, that pattern, does not capture the full picture, right? There are always exceptions to the pattern. So to illustrate, let's look at the basketball players again, right? So you can see their heights on screen. And if we specifically look at Lipsy, right, he is 6 feet 1 inch, which means that he is shorter than the average football player by an inch, showing us, right, that there can always be exceptions to general patterns. And obviously, he's still very, very good at what he does. But the principle is, or the reason I bring this up is because I'll be sharing research that describes general patterns, but these patterns are not always true or representative of a specific individual person's experience. So my goal is to describe general things, but it's not to be prescriptive, right? It's not for me to say, if you're a basketball player, you have to be tall, but instead just really to share research as a means of reflection. So is this your experience? Does your experience deviate from what the general pattern is? What can you learn from these patterns that will really help you be successful? And I think this is particularly important when we talk about things like socioeconomic status or social class, because oftentimes we don't want to reduce any one person's experience. So very much, right there, I have a goal of being able to share the general patterns, but use that information to really reflect on your own experience, how it matches your experience, how it doesn't match your experience, what can you learn from those different patterns. I'll also say, kind of for another example, right, we could say that to play basketball, you have to be tall, right? Tall people play basketball. But that would be perhaps an oversimplification of the relationship, right? We know people play basketball for a lot of different reasons besides being tall, right? Maybe they had family members play basketball. Maybe they grew up somewhere where basketball was popular. Maybe they like playing on smaller teams, right? Teams of 10 or 12 instead of teams of 50 or 60, right? Or perhaps they just enjoy the game. So even when we talk about general patterns, so things like tall people play basketball, those relationships are always more complex. Still, I think it's really helpful, right, to be able to pull out these different patterns. And so when we think about kind of the research that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to start and, well, I'll cover 3 points is perhaps what I should say. So first, we're going to talk about what social class is. What is your socioeconomic status? What does it mean? So how does that impact people's access to resources as well as their understanding of themselves? What are the different strengths that we can really derive from our social class background? And then finally, kind of as a third research content topic, I will talk about how social class impacts entrepreneurship. So what do we know from research in entrepreneurship about social class backgrounds? Really, though, my major goal or my big goal is to hopefully in a very short amount of time, help generate some insights to help you be the most successful entrepreneur that you can be. And I just recognize that success looks like very many different things. So success, however you define it. So we know entrepreneurs do what they do for a lot of different reasons, whether it's about gaining autonomy or some work lifestyle that they really enjoy, about novel incomes, generating income, or perhaps addressing different needs that they see in terms of their community. So we know that people do entrepreneurship for a lot of different reasons. So to accomplish this goal, hopefully of generating insight, I'll present information and oftentimes ask questions. So either self-reflection questions about you and your own journey to think about, or I'll ask you to share some in the chat about some observations that you might have seen from your own experience. And then finally, I will wrap up by really providing you a very practical resource or tool that looks at and specifically addresses one part of social class, which is this idea of social capital. So here we go. I would love if you'd be willing to, and if not, I'll generate some ideas for us as well. But if you could, in the chat box, just drop in there, what is the one resource or what has been the most valuable resource in your own entrepreneurial journey? So, and we can define resource really broadly here. So we can think about resources in terms of a source of supply, support, or aid, especially a resource or something that can be drawn on when needed. So what's one thing that's been helpful to you, whether you're exploring ideas about ventures or whether you're kind of in the mix or in the thick of that right now? So here we go. And I hit on that applied activity there. So here we go. In terms of research, what's really interesting is that people are beginning to study how demographic differences impact entrepreneurship. So how do differences in terms of our demographic or social identities really impact how we understand entrepreneurship? And it's this idea, right, specifically that everything from nationality to race and ethnicity to gender to neurodivergency or other different kind of factors, differences between us as people might actually impact the way that we approach entrepreneurship or execute our kind of entrepreneurial ventures. And so today I'm excited to specifically talk about social class as one of these differences between us that might impact our entrepreneurial journey. So I will just touch on terminology here for a second. Oftentimes people use the term socioeconomic status interchangeably with social class. Very much, right? Those two are often associated with each other, but I'll kind of split those out. The term social class is perhaps just a little bit broader, and we'll talk through what that means. But to pause for a second, what's really interesting to me, at least, is that social class has really been studied across a lot of different academic disciplines. So things like sociology, psychology, the health and medical field. More recently, perhaps in the last decade or two, organizational scholars, people like myself, have started to look at the ways that our social class backgrounds impact our work and working lives. So how does my social class specifically while I was growing up really impact the way that I work, the way I feel at work, the behaviors I do on work tasks, and how I interact with my colleagues? So following that movement in research, entrepreneurship scholars are really specifically looking at social class and how that impacts starting and running one's own business, or self-employment, or entrepreneurship. So it's been an exciting movement, I think, especially in the last few years, to see research that explicitly looks at the role of social class in entrepreneurship. So to start, let's define social class. But first, wait, isn't it taboo to talk about social class or people's socioeconomic status? I think that one thing that we see in terms of the conversation around social class, particularly in the US, is that it can feel uncomfortable to talk about research or talk about the idea of socioeconomic status or differences in background. What's really interesting is that research has really begun to show that as we talk about social class, as we talk about socioeconomic status, that actually has really positive impacts in terms of our relationships with other people, in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of being able to navigate our work and working lives. And so that's exciting to me. Of course, we want to talk about social class in a way that recognizes the dignity of every person and honestly talks or describes the potential advantages and disadvantages that people face based on their social class, but also talk about social class in a way that gives us a vocabulary. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of defining social class and hopefully equipping you with some different terms. Perhaps you're really familiar with this, but I definitely want to make sure that I start kind of at a basic or foundational point in the definition. And so when we think about defining social class, we define it as a person's access to economic resources, social resources, and cultural resources. So growing up in different social classes, whether that's a lower social class, a middle social class, or an upper social class, oftentimes means that you have access to more or less resources. And specifically, we talk about kind of these three different categories. So to look at those, let's dive in a little bit deeper. So social class impacts not only how many resources you have, where we oftentimes think about people from a higher social class having relatively more access to these types of resources, and those from a lower social class tend to have less access to these resources. We also want to think about this in terms of the types of resources that people have access to. So what are the unique features of these resources? So again, we look at these three kind of different buckets of resources, which sometimes people also use terms interchangeably. So they talk about forms of capital and not just using the terms resources. So to jump in or a little bit more explicitly, we talk about access to economic resources. So did I grow up in a family with relatively greater or less access to things like income or generational wealth? Am I able to access that, right? So we think about this in terms of entrepreneurship. Can I count on my family, right, to perhaps help me with startup funds or to perhaps fund me when I'm not generating income immediately? We can talk about things like access to social resources. So oftentimes we think about this in terms of connections to key individuals, influential individuals, as well as support from different types of relationships. So did I grow up with greater or fewer social resources because of my family? For example, do I have connections to high status or influential individuals, sort of as society determines those people to be that? And then finally, we can think about cultural resources, and this one's just a little bit more elusive, I think. So thinking about how social class relates to things like educational qualifications. Did my parents graduate from college? Do they have the certain kind of know-how that comes perhaps with more access to education? Did I have access as a child to different types of cultural artifacts, things like international experience or travel experience, or some different pieces like that? So these are really kind of the three different types of resources that are connected to or associated with growing up in different social class backgrounds. We can think about, well, I will just pause to say later I'm going to ask you, or we're going to walk through sort of an applied activity that you can use to take stock of your social resources or your social capital and talk about strategies to access new or different types of social resources that perhaps would be really relevant or helpful for you as an entrepreneur. So that to me is one of the really critical points that we'll hit on later. I'll make sure we have time to walk through that. Just in terms of social class, I'll pause to say that there are a lot of different ways we measure social class, and you'll see this come up or come out in terms of some of these different types of resources. So sometimes we look at social class in terms of objective factors. So we measure it by educational attainment, right? So are you a first generation student? Did your parents go to college? We talk about income. So what was your family's income, which you saw reflected in that economic resource? Occupational status. So what was the prestige of your parents' occupation while growing up? And then we sometimes talk about social class in terms of a more subjective understanding. So where would I put myself relative to other people in society in terms of my access to these different types of resources? So there's this very hard and fast access to resources that's perhaps a little bit more tangible, but there's also this subjective component that acts as a filter or a lens through which I see and understand the world. And this is just a point of reflection. So you can, whether you're taking notes or jotting down things, or if you just want to sit for a minute and think about this, based on your own access to resources as a child, specifically those economic, social, and cultural resources, how would you describe the social class that you grew up in? So thinking about that in terms of like a lower, middle, upper, or upper. So just go ahead and to yourself, place yourself kind of along that continuum. As you do that, I'd also think one really important point is that people can change social classes over the course of their life. So one part about this is that you might actually be in a different social class than your childhood social class. And so you can also perhaps reflect on if you've experienced any upward or downward mobility. And so just position yourself in terms of that. And as I talk through some of these more general patterns that we see in terms of social class and work and social class and entrepreneurship, perhaps you can then reflect better on whether that fits your experience or whether it doesn't feel like it fits your experience. So social class impacts our access to resources, but there's also this more cultural element. This is really important because social class then relates not only in terms of the types of resources you have access to, but it also can provide a blueprint for you in terms of what is considered normal behavior, right? What is the normal way to behave? What is a normal way to think? What is a normal way to feel? So research specifically, there's a theory called the sociocultural theory of social class speaks directly to this. And so what it says is that growing up in a lower social class where there's access to fewer material resources versus growing up in a social class context where there's more access to resources also shapes how we answer the question, who am I? Or how should someone like me act, think, or feel? So in this way, social class really helps us understand what is normal. What's interesting to me or tricky to me about this is oftentimes this understanding that's derived in terms of this answer to the question of who am I based on the social class that I was raised in can sort of feel like a fish recognize the water that they're swimming in, right? We're almost so immersed in this that it can be hard to recognize that I am indeed kind of in this context or grew up in a context. So I think it takes some reflexivity to step back and really be able to recognize that. So with this, right, so this answer to the question of who am I based on my social class context while I was growing up, really facilitates two different understandings of oneself. And so a lot of this work I should recognize comes directly from Nicole Stevens and her colleagues who have done a lot on the sociocultural theory of self. And so what researchers are finding, or some of the theories around this are saying, is that lower class contexts facilitate an interdependent model of self. An answer to the question of who am I that really brings an interdependent lens. So to speak to this a little bit more, because lower class contexts are oftentimes characterized by material and social resources that ask people to adjust and respond to the needs and preferences for others, they oftentimes develop a more interdependent understanding of themselves. And what this means, or what this kind of turns out to be, is that over time, these folks, right, people who adopt an interdependent model of self really begin to enact other focused behaviors over time, and understanding that their self is really connected to others and to their social context. So, for example, students who are from a lower social class versus a higher social class are often motivated to go to college, to attend university, to help their families and communities. And this model of self, this interdependent model of self, really affords other focused patterns of thinking and of behaving, or making choices that reflect a preference for connection. I'll pause to say that as we're talking through this, and then in the next slide, I'm going to ask you the questions in terms of what do you really resonate with this, or are there examples of this that you see in your own life? Fantastic. In contrast, what the sociocultural theory of social class really says is that people who grow up in a higher social class context, so an upper, middle, or upper social class context, have access to material and social resources that really encourage them to focus on and prioritize their individual desires, preferences, and interests. So, for example, if you have abundant financial resources and opportunities to make choices and have control, it's really possible for you to act without needing other people's support. And therefore, it makes sense that you would pave your own way, right? So as a result of this more independent model of self, people begin to understand themselves as somebody who operates a little bit more separately from others and their social context. So for example, right, another example from higher education, we know that students from higher class backgrounds often attend colleges and universities with a motivation of, quote, paving their own path, or developing their own sense of self. So this independent model really affords patterns of thinking and feeling where a person will oftentimes express uniqueness or differentiate themselves from others. So kind of as two general patterns, we see that folks who grew up in a lower social class develop more interdependent model of self, whereas the general pattern being that those who grow up in a higher social class tend to develop an independent model of self. So again, just a point of reflection, and you're welcome again just to jot this down or take a second and think through. So which of these two models, a more independent or a more interdependent model of self, do you resonate with more, and why? And I'll give you just maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 seconds to think about that. So which one, and what's a reason, or how have you seen that in your own life? What I think is amazing, or what I think is really interesting, is that there are different strengths then that come really from our social class backgrounds in terms of these different understandings of who we are. And I'd highlight that, I'd really highlight that it's important to take these and understand them for yourself, but also begin to see and speak to some of your own strengths in terms of this. And so again, right, we'll maybe start here with, we'll maybe start here with that interdependent model of self, right? And so some of the strengths that really come out of this is that people are oftentimes motivated to connect, to collaborate, to have really effective social processes. Very much, right, it's in an interdependent model of self assumes that it's normal to adjust to your context, to be connected to others, to respond to others' needs and preferences and interests, which means over time that these people oftentimes bring a great strength in terms of increased empathy and compassion, and oftentimes bring a very pro-social or others-focused strength to different teams that they engage with or different projects that they jump into. I think another strength that comes from this is having a very focus on the present. So being able to think through things in terms of what does this mean for the here and now. Wonderful. To shift and think about the more, and actually, I'm so sorry on screen, I'll have to update this. I flip-flopped the titles. And so on the left-hand side, right, is that actually interdependent model of self. And on the right-hand side is the independent model of self in terms of strengths. That's my fault for that mistake. But an independent model of self also brings really great strengths to the table. So oftentimes these people are motivated towards individual achievement and success, and really adopt an analytic cognitive style, one that comes out of the access to different choice behaviors. we'll see these people or folks with an independent model of self oftentimes operate with a lot of autonomy and confidence, and are taught over the course of their lives to be imaginative, to pave their own path, to break the rules. And so this might come with a different approach to ideation than someone with a more interdependent model of self. I think a final strength of folks that come from this type of background or have this model of self is that there really is a promotion or future-oriented focus as well. And so I would just emphasize across the board that these kind of answers to this question of like, who am I? How do I operate in the world, that are based on our social class context growing up, really do bring a lot of strengths with them, or can bring different strengths to the table. If you would, and you're welcome to send this to the group as you jump in, I'd be curious what is obvious to you in terms of application in an entrepreneurship setting. And so where do you see the strengths of an interdependent model in entrepreneurship? And then perhaps where do you see the strengths of an independent model in entrepreneurship? You're welcome to drop some of those answers into the chat. Fantastic. I would love to, and as you kind of think about that, I would just love to say, I think there are a lot of different ways, especially when we think about entrepreneurship in terms of its entire life cycle. So the ways that people might ideate differently based on a model of self, to the ways that they might really engage with different team members, or create social resources, or be able to work through startups, right? The ways that we problem solve relate to this. And so there are huge strengths that come out of this. I'm going to go ahead. Yep, there we go. Again, you don't need to necessarily drop this in the chat box, but another point of reflection is really thinking about how you've seen your own social class background operate as a source of strength, is when you think about your own journey as an entrepreneur, or wherever you are in that entrepreneurship life cycle. I would love to bring our on screen. I'll say that like oftentimes we forget about people's backgrounds who are entrepreneurs. And so 3 examples of 3 different entrepreneurs, all of which have very different backgrounds and come from different places. I think what's amazing is that we see, right, like that people can leverage their experiences, particularly their access to resources and their understanding of themselves that come from their social class, to be successful. And so these 3 people highlight 3 different stories related to that. For the sake of time, I won't jump into them in too much detail. And pause and look at what Stephanie said. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I love that response. Stephanie was just speaking to the ways, right? Like, yeah, so actually I love this, right? In the first part of Stephanie's our response to that question, talking about the ways that we kind of perceive entrepreneurship perhaps to be a more independent activity, right? A solo activity. And I think one thing that's really important, or one thing that I would be excited about as you all kind of walk through this, is really as you engage with other entrepreneurs, if you're kind of an aspiring entrepreneur, or if you're kind of an active entrepreneur, is really sharing your story about the ways that your entrepreneurship journey has perhaps been more interdependent than independent. One thing that I have been really, really amazed by in my own research with entrepreneurs is actually just how much they rely on other people to do the work that they're doing. And so I won't get too deep into this. I'm collecting some data with some fantastic co-authors, Marilla Kingsley and Michael Cummings, who are at the University of Arkansas. And what's been really interesting about that is we've been finding, as we speak with entrepreneurs and talk to them about their class backgrounds, is that we're hearing that entrepreneurs from both kind of a lower social class and a higher social class, a middle or upper social class, are accessing different types of social resources and see the needs for different types of social resources that are perhaps a little bit more interdependent in nature than one might see from the outside. And I think, Stephanie, you're right on there, right? In terms of like really being able to see the interdependent folks, seeing community as an important piece. But I love how kind of no matter your social class background, right, we can adapt, we can bring those things on, or we might have a similar goal, but for different reasons. Yeah, it's so interesting. Okay, I'm going to pause and let the chat be for a second, but then we'll really dig into this a little bit more. So how does entrepreneur social class background specifically impact entrepreneurship? And so to do this, I'm going to just show you a kind of overall picture that I've been working on with some fantastic collaborators, Leif and Anna and Eric, who are from the University of Hohenheim and Oxford. What we did is we went ahead and we pulled all of the research across entrepreneurship that talks about social class and synthesize that research into an overall picture. And so what we are finding based on about a little bit over 160 different articles in entrepreneurship is that we really are seeing that entrepreneurs' access to resources during early childhood, so their social class background, are impacting entrepreneurial outcomes. And today I'm just going to briefly touch on these mechanisms, so these explanations for how our social class background as entrepreneurs are impacting outcomes. So 3 different things. The first thing that we'll talk about is this idea of receiving resources. And I think this is one place where we do really see an advantage oftentimes given to those folks from a higher social class background in terms of really accessing financial capital, which can ease some of those liquidity constraints, right? So through inheritances, through gifts, through kind of day-to-day or weekly support, oftentimes those from a higher social class have access to a little bit more financial capital up front. This doesn't mean it's not an obstacle that can't be overcome, but we do see an advantage given there. And then secondly, we see resources transferred in terms of human capital. So this understanding, right, from your parents' education and exposure to different successful business owners or entrepreneurs that can foster different mindsets around entrepreneurship. So do I see entrepreneurship as something that is really for generating income? Do I see examples of successful entrepreneurs? Do I see examples of entrepreneurs who are really entering growth-oriented forms of entrepreneurship? So we see social class being tied to entrepreneurial outcomes through this idea that people receive different amounts and types of resources. Secondly, kind of the second overarching mechanism that we'll talk about is that our social class impacts the norms around how to act as an entrepreneur, So really this idea that people can acquire different tastes and behaviors related to entrepreneurship depending on their class environment or their class origin. And this hits, I think, on some of the comments that are coming into the chat box in terms of, right, perhaps this impacts whether we're excited about a more growth-oriented entrepreneurship, or whether my identity as an entrepreneur is perhaps more about my community or mission-focused. We also see that perhaps at this point, right, this norm of what it means to be an entrepreneur would again be happening through role modeling. So do I have access to different types of entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, or not, based on my background? And then the third piece, this idea of dealing with constraints, I think is super interesting. And this goes a little bit back to this idea that there are different material resources that impact how we understand things like risk-taking, resourcefulness, self-efficacy, or role-breaking. So we know that from research that experiences of threat, uncertainty, or resource scarcity that are kind of built into these different social class backgrounds can imprint or can impact entrepreneurial cognition. So how we understand taking risks, leveraging resources. Do I feel comfortable? Do I not feel comfortable? Am I able to feel confident making decisions? Am I willing to break the rules or take a few more risks? So these can play out in a few different ways. And then finally, the third sort of explanation or mechanism that we know impacts this is access to external opportunities and resources through relationships, or this idea that folks from different social class backgrounds have access to different types of external resources and opportunities. Sometimes we see that those folks from a lower social class are more constrained when it comes to more instrumental forms of capital. So high status contacts that might be able to make the right introduction to somebody who's a venture capitalist, for example. But on the other hand, we see those folks from a lower social class perhaps having access to a little bit more socio-emotional support or can rely on their communities a little bit differently. So again, not better or worse, but very different access. Again, I'll just kind of zoom out and let you take a look at this. So we really, through kind of these big pictures, look at how resources through these 3 different mechanisms. So this access to resources, developing kind of norms around entrepreneurship, and then accessing external resources and opportunities really do impact entrepreneurial outcomes and performance. So I know that's a really big picture, a really kind of wide zoomed out picture. I'd be so happy, especially offline, to talk with anyone about kind of some more details around this, whether it be like a specific mechanism or a specific point as we move through here. Fantastic. On screen, we're going to kind of zoom in and think about that third mechanism. So this external access to resources and opportunity, these social resources that can be so important. And so as a kind of applied part for about the next 5 minutes, I want to show you and give you a tool that will hopefully be helpful when you can kind of look at and assess your own social resources and think about being able to build or access different types of resources. And I know this might be more or less applicable depending kind of on where you are in your entrepreneurial journey, or kind of like, and hopefully applicable across that, whether you're a student, an aspiring entrepreneur, kind of in the mix, have sold and are starting new, are kind of a more serial entrepreneur. So here we go. We talk about this in terms of social resources or social capital. And let's do this. I'm actually going to zoom. I'm going to switch things that you're seeing on screen. And I'm going to also drop this in the chat box. So this is, and let me make sure this goes to everybody, not just one person. So this is a resource that I was able to create. Based on some other really awesome resources out there that specifically can operate or look at your own social resources, take stock of those, and then think about how you can strategically access new or different types of resources. And I will say, of course, right, social capital is tied to social class. It's one of the things that our social resources in general are one things that correlates or associated with different social classes. But of course, right, like same example as basketball, there are a ton of other things that impact why people have access to different types of social resources. So please use this as well. I'll say that there are two main types of social resources that we think about in terms of what it means to be successful at work and in entrepreneurship. And so the first is this idea of instrumental support. So instrumental support can be thought of in terms of really enabling, right, these relationships that enable the exchange of important work-related or entrepreneurship-related information, advice, and support, right? So instrumental, very tangible work-related support. The second type of support that's really important is expressive support. So this is these are relationships that enable the exchange of social and emotional support, things like encouragement, that person that lifts you up, right? So we're going to talk about those two types of social resources and where you're at in terms of accessing those, and how perhaps you can think about accessing those a little bit differently. And then I'm cognizant of time that we're moving through a lot of information. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to this document that is now getting sent into the chat. And then you're welcome to download it and use it kind of for your own purposes. So here we go. I'm going to skip past a couple of pages that are just more overlooking pages. And I think you should be able to see this on your screen. So I'm going to jump in if you're not able to. And let me do this to make it a little bit larger. There we go. So the first thing is step one, which just asks you to think about the people that you turn to in terms of instrumental and expressive support. And so you can just easily follow the prompts kind of on your own time to do this. So writing down the names of the people that you rely on for instrumental support. So entrepreneurship related information, resources, or problem solving that really help you start or run your own business. So these can be people that are kind of inside or outside your own organization. For students, people who are at ISU, people who aren't at ISU. Perhaps it's even if you're running a business that has employees, it can be people that you're working with or people in your network. The second thing is to write down the name of people that you rely on for the more social or emotional support as an entrepreneur. So these are the people that perhaps aren't giving you really direct tactile information, but those people that are kind of your cheerleaders, the people who know what you might need to see, what you might need in terms of a lift me up, encouragement, compassion, or even a little bit more of that like emotional support. In step two, you will go back to that list and just really think about the characteristics of these different types of relationships. So listing the number of people from the first step that kind of fall across these different categories. In step three, there's a reflection piece to really look at the composition of those people and ask questions about your access to instrumental support. And so there are 5 questions there that help you recognize what challenges, what might be missing in that network, and then thinking about what the implications or actions are based on those different reflection questions. The next is, again, a very similar process, but related to your different expressive support. So looking again at the access to different social resources related to expressive support, who are the people that you have access to or that you don't have access to, and then what might be some implications or actions that you could take. The next step helps you kind of look forward or think about what social resources you might need. So it asks you to identify up to 4 different skills or types of expertise that you need to be successful as an entrepreneur. So anything from something technical to more administrative skills or certain know-how, right? Perhaps about fundraising or about different program management skills. So actually listing those 4 things that you need. Again, that's asked for expressive ties. So are there types of support that you might need that you're not actually, that you don't have access to right now? And then finally, in the last step, it asks you to kind of work through quantifying those things and then putting into practice or really looking at what types of support you need and looking again at the implications and actions based on identifying those really specific types of relationships. At the risk of going for too long, I'll just stop and pause and say what's really interesting right across both social class research and entrepreneurship research is that mentors make a huge difference. And so especially when I reflect on my own social class background, I'll just say that there is such a huge, the mentors that I've had have been such a huge advocate for me and have helped me access either resources that I don't have, perhaps based on my class background, but they've also helped me see things from a different lens. And so if I naturally have a more interdependent lens, they've helped me see things or encourage me to implement a more independent lens when I needed, and vice versa. So just mentors being such an important or critical space for this. And so in this last page, which I won't get into in too much detail, it really just walks through some practical steps in terms of perhaps reaching out to specific individuals to fill in some of those gaps in terms of mentorship. And so I think hopefully if you do anything or if you spend any time on any of these pages, my big encouragement would actually be spending time on this one so that you can identify people who help fill in the gaps, right? Who help fill in the gaps and really help see you take on things that you might not take on just on your own. I think I'm getting close. I'd love to leave some time for questions. And so I will stop there and turn it back over to you, Jean.
Great, thanks. That was a lot of information. Appreciate it. A lot of insight there. So we will open up for questions here. So if you have anything, drop it in the chat and we will get to those questions. You shared a lot of tangible points and it's greatly appreciated of being able to see where we've come from and being able to use that as a strength for moving forward. So I'll check the chat here real quick and see if we have anything. Midhum had said, I don't think an independent model will take us to its full potential. Interdependent model, in my experience, open doors to more meaningful impact and results. We had Rita asking, how do you see success of collaborative ventures with people of independent and interdependent selves?
Great. Yeah, I think those are some very great points. And feel free to add more questions in here. I'll perhaps just speak to the first comment and say, right, like one thing that's been super interesting to me, I'm primarily like a social class researcher and not primarily an entrepreneurship researcher, but have become more and more interested in entrepreneurship, because I do think one thing that's been really interesting to me or surprising to me is just how many different goals entrepreneurs have. And one thing that's striking to me from kind of outside the entrepreneurship bubble is that we have this picture of like what the perfect entrepreneur looks like, right? Kind of this description of the lone person, like, building the way or bridging the way. And really, right, like really how necessary kind of skills or perspectives from both a more independent and more an interdependent model together, I think can help people reach a range of different skills, right? And so Success looks like so many different things. One thing that's been really interesting to me from some of the qualitative interviews that we've had, some of the qualitative interviews that we've been doing with entrepreneurs is oftentimes, right, like we have different entrepreneurs who want just that really are looking to do like growth-oriented entrepreneurship and access those. And so they rely on kind of different frameworks at different points of time that are helpful. And then again, like, right, like we have folks that are doing a lot more like community or missional entrepreneurship where they rely on different frames. But I would just say, and I think I would reflect back that I don't think a single frame in terms of the independent or interdependent model of self will take us as far as we need to go just on their own. I think there's something really important, right? Just about being reflective about what's my tendency, what are the strengths of that tendency, and then what might be, right, what might be in my blind spot, right? What might I be missing, right? What might I want to ask somebody else to help with in terms of this. And so I'd say I don't think that there's necessarily like a better or worse in terms of those frames, but really what the best practice would be self-awareness and tapping into other people's strengths. One thing I think is really interesting, I think this speaks to Rita's question in some ways, is just how important this is on teams. And as we think about building, right, kind of our tribe around us as we're entrepreneurs, but also as we build like our formal teams, whether that's in a startup team or whether that's kind of like when you think about actually hiring employees, and just being thoughtful or cognizant about some of these different strengths, right? Like a person that really is going to say, like, I'm going to help with the group and social processes go smoothly, right? This person that's geared that way. And how important it is to be able to build our teams to really reflect some diversity in terms of social class background. There's some exciting research that comes out of research in higher education that actually looks at groups of people and their performance as teams. Well, actually, I should back up and say is that the research in higher education shows, and of course, this is not entrepreneurship context, this is higher education, but I think that there's some application here. We oftentimes will see folks from a higher social class because of that independent model of self perform better on individual tasks, right? So a test, something that they are completing on their own as a general pattern, not always. But what's been really cool is there's some research, Andrea Dittman's research, who shows that when we look at group work, it's actually teams that have a higher percentage of people from a lower social class background that outperform teams that have fewer people from a lower social class background. And that is because of more effective social and group processes. What I love about this is it helps me at least think about if I'm in a position as an entrepreneur, am I looking for more diverse social class backgrounds in terms of my team? Am I looking at people's different strengths in terms of this? So I don't know that that's like a single example in terms of like successive collaborative ventures, but I will just say, like, speaking to like how important it is to not only think about right, a lot of different points of social identity or diversity, but that it really can be a strength on our teams. Yes.
Thank you. And Kiara would like to know, what are your best networking tips?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. Yes. I'm trying to think about what research says about this instead of just from personal experience. One thing that let me think about this. So I will just speak to Kiara. It's interesting. I spoke a couple years ago at a conference for women in IT, but I actually had another speaker in that program talked about networking tips, and they said a few things that really resonated with me. I think one is actually just right, networking to your strengths, so being you. And so if you are a person, right, like oftentimes this is similar where we think of like the best networker in the room, right, like really extroverted and able to connect with anybody, and us trying to be somebody we're not is can undercut our ability to actually network effectively. So thinking about how you enjoy networking, so whether that's grabbing coffee with somebody or connecting, right, like via email, or being able to like ask for a connection, is really to network in a way that feels most comfortable to you. I do, and I will say, like, for me at least, or actually I'll speak to the research on this. The research on this oftentimes says in terms of social class that folks from a higher social class have less of an issue approaching people in higher power or higher status positions. And oftentimes because of that independent model of self, whereas folks from a lower social class are kind of conditioned or socialized, right, to have a big respect for authority. So might hold back a little bit more when it comes to approaching people that are in higher authority positions or roles. And so one thing I would say, like specifically if you come from a lower social class background, is to not be afraid or to kind of muster up some courage or go ahead and reach out and make the connection. And just recognize that perhaps that might be a norm that's actually really powerful or helpful for you. I think about this when I'm with students in the classroom oftentimes and trying to make my students who come from lower class backgrounds feel like I'm really accessible, right? Because it might not be their natural tendency to reach out, right? Or to connect for office hours or to connect to grab coffee or whatever else the case is. But I think that applies sort of in the world or realm of entrepreneurship, like the entrepreneurial ecosystem as well. So being yourself as you network, doing it in a way that's comfortable for you, but not hesitating to make the connection or making the ask.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions that you'd like to pose towards Christy? She's here to answer any questions you might have. Give us another second. But in the meantime, though, we have other programs that are coming up that are open and available to the community here, focused around entrepreneurship. On Tuesday, April 2nd, we have a free lunch speaker session with Bruce Lerman that he'll talk about his success and lessons learned while being a serial entrepreneur. And then, of course, the next Start Something series next week will be on entrepreneurial passions. You can tune in again and visit our website to get the links and register. Judy says, great advice about networking, Christy. And then Tia is asking, on the subject of availability, what is too little or too much for partners or customers?
Yeah, good question. And I think, Tia, if I'm misinterpreting this, feel free to jump in the chat and let me know if I'm picking up on that. But what is on the subject of availability, what is too little or too much for partners or customers? I think you're speaking in terms of like accessing them and their availability. If I'm interpreting that wrong, feel free to jump in the chat to do that. I think what's so interesting, well, actually, I'm going to circle back to just this idea of mentors and how important a mentor is, because, oh yeah, yes, like office hours. Yes, absolutely. Yep. Great question. So, yeah, I think that this is one of those things. I'm just going to circle back to mentors because everything seems so idiosyncratic sometimes. And from my understanding of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, there are so many, what we might call, right, like hidden rules of the game, or like unspoken norms, right? Things that people don't say aloud, but is sort of the norm. So of course, I'm always going to look and say, like, did they say aloud, right? Like, is there a set expectation that's public information or public knowledge, right? When I think about connecting with partners or customers, or how often I should email, how often I should call, is it appropriate to reach out to this person? So did they say something that's like public information about that? But there might also just be kind of norms or ways of operating that aren't made apparent or explicit. And so this is where I think a mentor is such a helpful person or thing or person or access or type of resource when we walk through entrepreneurship. In the sense of, right, if you can just ask them the question, right, like, is it appropriate for me to reach out to this person? What would be the best way to reach out to this person? Or even when it comes to connecting with customers, right, like, how often should I do that? How should I do that, right? Just somebody else that has more experience or knowledge and is able to share those kind of norms or hidden rules of the game. I think when it comes to things, I think the office hours is actually a really good example of this, because you can look on a syllabus and say, like, oh, here are the office hours posted, but is it normal to go to office hours? Is it not? And I always think about my experience in undergrad and a couple of connections I had with students who were just a year or two ahead of me, and my ability to ask them questions like, which professors really mean this? Like, how do I show up to office hours? What am I supposed to do? Right. So just those sources of information that help us understand more context, right? Like that can give us more context about networking decisions.
Great, thank you. Tia then continues to ask, if you find them outside of office hours, are they actually available?
Tia, good question. Are you speaking specifically about professors or more of like different folks that you would connect with as a part of entrepreneurship? I'm guessing professors. Mentors, yes. Okay. And if you find them outside of office hours. Yeah. So I will just say, it's funny. I will actually, let me do this for a minute since we have like just a couple minutes left. Let me pop over to here and share this. Maybe I'll walk through this really quickly. And I think this might get at some different pieces, especially if like you're perhaps more junior in terms of entrepreneurship or sort of at the beginning of this. What I think is really interesting is one thing, and I know that it happens for folks from different class backgrounds, but also, I think based on our gender or perhaps other kind of different social identities that we hold near, we might feel more or less comfortable talking to or asking somebody to be a mentor, which is why I kind of put this together. So I will just say, like, one thing, if they're actually available, if someone will be a mentor, the best thing you can do is actually ask them to be a mentor. But the ways that I kind of think about walking through this is first just identifying 3 to 5 people that you respect and you think would have the resources to be a really effective mentor for you. And oftentimes these can be people connected to those different types of instrumental or expressive support that you need. They can or they can't be entrepreneurs. It depends on what you need. But then go ahead and just make a list of what you'd expect for someone in a mentoring relationship. So really specific, right? How often would you expect to meet with them? Would you prepare for meetings? Would you have specific content prepared? Would you see things like reading a book or doing something like that together? So be really specific about what you would expect from a mentoring relationship. The next step would just be think about the best way to reach out to them. So do you have a pre-existing relationship with them? Are they a professor? Are they your business leader that you've been able to connect with in the past? Or do you have someone that can connect you to them? Can you send an email to ask for a meeting, or can you set up a phone call? And then just construct a clear message where you're actually asking them to mentor you over a certain period of time. So tell them that you're looking for a mentor on your entrepreneurship journey, what you would expect from that relationship, and ask them if they'd be willing to serve as a mentor. I'd always say you can pause and say, like, you're welcome to get back to me, or just consider this or recommend somebody else. I think one of the things that's really interesting to me, and I'm cognizant of time here, is that if we don't ask right, the person is not probably going to naturally offer themselves up as a mentor. And so there's something about that advocacy, or really thinking through who would I want to mentor me? How can I be really clear about the expectations of that relationship? And then just ask, but be okay if they say no. So sometimes, right, people can say no based for a lot of different reasons, which is super fair, right? Like, a lot of people have a lot going on, but I think it's really important to actually ask if you're interested in being mentored by someone, but do so in a way that's really clear about what your expectations are from that relationship. So if you ask to set up a meeting and talk through that on the phone or via email, that way you can perhaps have a little bit more conversation around that. But if you ask, it's okay if they say no, don't be too disappointed. And I always recommend that you think about a few different people that you could perhaps talk to or ask. I always think about this in terms of like what's low stakes. And so in my experience, meeting with someone and saying, like, I'm looking or interested to have a mentor for the next 6 months while I'm working on this specific project, what I would imagine this looking like, for example, is that we would meet every 2 weeks for an hour on Zoom. I will come prepared with questions to ask you over that time. Or as a different example, I'm looking for someone to be a mentor through my last 2 years of this program. What I would expect is that we read one book over the course of the year and we meet once a month to talk about it. So being really clear, asking really specifically, and then hopefully seeing, right, like if they're available or not. So that's hopefully a little bit more practical, Tia, to your question.
Great. Christy, thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us, and for all of our online attendees too. We really appreciate you joining us, and Christy, your time and sharing your expertise on the subject matter. So thanks everyone. Hope to see you again next week, and contact us if you have any questions. So appreciate it. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, huge thanks. Folks are welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn or my Iowa State email.
All right, thanks everyone.